My name is Marc Myers. I'm the author of the new book, Why Jazz Happened. The Beatles don't kill jazz in 1964 when they arrive here in February of '64, but what you do see in the years that follow, we know full well that copycat bands come, other major rock bands come from England, other bands pop up here in the United States. So what you do see is the draining of jazz budgets. You see the shifting of talent out of jazz departments and into folk and rock departments. You see record companies pulling producers out and saying, "Go find me another rock band. Go find four guys with long hair. We've got records to make." And you just see that jazz starts to play a lesser role at almost all the labels across the board. And what you see to survive for many jazz musicians and for the jazz divisions is they start to take what are ostensibly new forms of music. The Beatles, Burt Bacharach, the songwriters at this point in time, they're singer-songwriters. You see less of a reliance on Tin Pan Alley, which had basically been the hit factory for decades, and that jazz musicians had relied on by jazzing up Tin Pan Alley songs for the most part. But what you see suddenly is the rise of the singer-songwriter. The person who wrote the song is actually singing it, and it's almost very difficult to duplicate because they recorded it, and people's ears won't accept that someone else is trying to do it easily. So what you see are many musicians, many jazz musicians and producers begin recording transistor radio hits, pop hits, jazz interpretations of these hits to ostensibly not so much piggyback, but it's really survival. And at the same time, many of these efforts are quite excellent. I mean, they're brilliant, whether it's Stan Getz or Wes Montgomery. By taking on these songs, they give these songs a completely different dimension and a new life. But without the Beatles' arrival and without the rise of the youth culture and rock and roll, the pressure would not be there for jazz to go modern. You wouldn't see jazz moving in this direction unless there was enormous financial, economic pressure for them to do so, or else wind up without work. By the late 1960s, jazz musicians are watching the entire youth culture gravitate toward rock and roll. And for them, they can't quite figure out, what's going on or why. But what's happening and what they start to realize is that the electronic instrument, the electric guitar, the electric bass, the electric piano, the organ, these things are generating enormous popularity, particularly the guitar. Because the guitar, you can see the artist's face when the guitarist is playing, and you can't really see the artist's face. You can't connect as well when they're playing a trumpet or a saxophone because those instruments are in the artist's mouth. So with the rise of the electric guitar, the rise of the rock star, so to speak, the jazz musician starts to figure out that they need something to reconnect with the youth market, if not to take them back, at least to join the parade. And you see more and more jazz musicians start to adapt and start to play electronic instruments. Now, this may sound ridiculous today, but as late as the late 1960s, jazz was primarily an acoustic instrument. Acoustic instruments were set up and jazz musicians played them. And there was a real abhorrence of electric instruments, just as folk musicians early on had the same feeling about electronic instruments, that they were somehow going to corrupt the form, or the form was somehow going to sell out. But jazz musicians, especially the young ones, start to realize that by taking on electric instruments and also embracing volume, because rock is a volume form. It's an electronic form, but it's also a high volume form. By adapting these two, and also the psychedelic overlay, you find the rise of jazz rock fusion. Jazz musicians, interestingly, were the inventors of the long form. In the early 1950s, as the LP came out, you saw longer forms of music. So jazz musicians by the late 1950s are playing almost entire sides of music. The rock musician picks up on this, and you see longer solos at Woodstock, longer solos at Monterey, longer solos at Big Sur. And the jazz musician, though, realizes they already know how to do this. All they need are the electronic instruments, and they need the volume, especially as rock and most music goes into arenas in the early 1970s. The outdoor concert, as we knew it, at Atlantic City, Monterey, and at Woodstock, is pretty much ended after what happens at Altamont with the Rolling Stones and the shooting and the Hells Angels. Many communities ban outdoor concerts. Most concerts now have to go indoors, and once rock musicians go indoors into these new sports arenas, playing on nights when the sports teams aren't there, dark nights, so to speak, you find that jazz musicians are following suit, but you can't reach large numbers of people in an arena unless you're playing an electronic instrument, unless somebody's turning up the volume. So jazz rock fusion comes as a result of these pressures that you see in the culture, but also the development of technology that allows the volume to be turned up. But keep in mind, at Woodstock, much of the technology fails. The only thing that actually does function is the sound system. So the so-called sound system that we take for granted today at most events, it doesn't really come to form. They don't figure out how to make that work well until the early 70s. For more information about my book, Why Jazz Happens, go to whyjazzhappened.com.